All right, everyone. Well, let's go ahead and get started. First, I just want to welcome all of you here today. It's a pleasure to see so many people here. My name is Dr. Steven Skultety. I'm a member of the faculty here at the University of Mississippi, where I also serve as director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. The mission of the Declaration Center is to ensure that students and faculty and members of the Mississippi community have opportunities to think about and study the nature of American freedom. We're doing a number of things to try and operationalize that mission. On the one hand, for students, the Declaration Center supports a Freedom Studies minor, and it offers Freedom Studies classes. We also now offer a Freedom Studies scholarship. And I'm very proud to say this year was our inaugural group of our 18 first Freedom Studies scholars. And we're trying to match talented students to opportunities around the country. For faculty, we've just started a faculty research group, and we're soon going to be funding faculty research projects. And then finally, for the public, we are just starting to offer a sort of a community discussion symposium. And finally, we offer public lectures like the one you'll see tonight, which afterwards you'll be able to find on the Declaration Center YouTube channel. So if any of that sounds good, by the way, or if you're not on our email list for some reason, just send us an email at freedom@olemiss.edu, and we'd be happy to put you on our email list. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight Rich Lowry. Rich graduated from the University of Virginia, where he studied history and English. He had a distinguished career as a journalist, and now he serves as editor-in-chief for the National Review. He's the author of 4 different books. First, he actually published a fiction book. I actually didn't know that. In 2009, he co-authored Banquo's Ghosts, and he's the author of 3 nonfiction books, the last of which was published in 2019, called The Case for Nationalism: How It Made Us Powerful, United, and Free. And in fact, that book was so good that it was subject to kind of over-the-top criticism from both Foreign Affairs and The Washington Post. So good job. And speaking of ridiculous over-the-top attacks, I do want to say something publicly about the recent attacks on Rich Lowry that were launched on the basis of just mispronouncing a word. Now, I know in today's environment, when we hear about that sort of thing or read about it, the natural tendency is for us to say, this is just insane. We live in such crazy times. But I want to tell you, it's not crazy. It's actually rather coordinated. I really think there's a systematic attempt today in our culture to rebrand deeply thoughtful, smart, and eminently reasonable people like Rich Lowry as extreme. And they're doing that in order to create people's assumptions about what it means to be moderate. I think people are hoping that you'll be at a dinner party sometime and you'll say, you know, I'm rather moderate in my politics. Unlike that extremist Rich Lowry, he's beyond the pale, right? And of course, that shifts your assumption about what it means to be moderate, but it shifts it in a particular direction. Now, I myself have been subject to these kind of attacks. Members of my team have been subjects of these attacks. And what they all have in common is this. These are not attempts to establish a dialogue. These are not attempts to sit down and carefully examine ideas as part of a conversation, or an attempt to carefully debate definitions or evidence or arguments. Those are only meant to create sort of a narrative or a vibe to make people unthinkingly react to their targets as dangerous, or I might even say weird. If you, like me, are sick and tired of this sort of thing, I hope you'll come to all of the Declaration Center's events. As director of the Declaration Center, I am proud to introduce Rich Lowry to you. I'm proud to be on stage tonight with him. And I'm proud to belong to a university that accepts diversity of opinion and welcomes thoughtful dialogue with well-read, interesting people who believe in the legacy of American freedom. So help me in welcoming Rich Lowry to the podium.
Thank you, everyone. It's a true pleasure to be here with you this evening because, as far as I'm concerned, the two greatest American innovations are the Declaration of Independence and SEC football. So we're putting them together tonight, and I really appreciate those kind words and the spirit of them. This is a country that desperately needs more free speech, more argument, more disagreement. It's not something we should be afraid of. It's not something we should have to hide in safe spaces to avoid. It's something we should embrace, certainly on college campuses. So I appreciate so much that your commitment to bringing that here to Ole Miss. And by the way, you remarked this on this over-the-top attack I was subjected to at the Washington Post. We should recognize someone who is much more familiar with over-the-top attacks from the Washington Post than I am, the great Senator Trent Lott. So thanks so much for being here, sir. All right, so I'm going to talk about 20 minutes or so, do a little punditry, because that's my day job, and then talk about a little bit kind of deeper aspects of the debate over the nature of America and our history. So I'll talk for about 20 minutes and take some questions. Speaking of questions, by the way, I got a doozy from my 6-year-old son a little while ago. You never know what they're going to come up with. So I was driving him around town, and he asked me from the back seat of the car, "Daddy, are you going to die one day?" I was like, all right, okay, I guess we're going there. So I couldn't lie to him. I couldn't deny this ineluctable fact of human existence. So I said, yeah, I'm going to die one day. And then there's a long pause, then a voice from the back. But then who's going to drive us places? So, it really feels good to be loved. Let me tell you. So, all right. So, our politics have been pretty dull. The Republican primary was boring. The Democratic primary didn't exist. And then we had the first debate, which if Trump loses this election, which is quite possible, that first debate with Joe Biden will be the most catastrophic success in the history of American politics, knocking him out and getting in a replacement candidate who could very well defeat him. The advantage, though, it did avoid having a Trump-Biden rematch, which I don't think anyone really was looking forward to. It reminds me a little bit of the philosopher Voltaire once commented. He went to an orgy and he said, "Once was an experiment, but twice would be perverse." So we're avoiding the rematch. Instead, we have a Trump-Harris rematch. And I'll just give you a couple thoughts on both of them and my take for whatever it's worth on where I think the race is headed, and then I'm going to go to 30,000 feet to talk a little bit about America in a deeper sense. So Trump, I think, is really a very good, terrible politician. He's both of these things. Very good, great at promoting and advancing an image of strength. He's entertaining. He's memorable. He's charismatic, right? He won the Republican primary debates in 2016 pretty much by always standing in the middle of the stage. He was leading the polls, so they put him in the middle, being a foot taller than everyone else, being oranger than everyone else, and just having a greater sense of command. He would be saying something, and one of the other candidates would want to interrupt him, and he'd say, "Shh," and they'd stop talking. They'd shut up, right? Trent knows this never happens, right? Even with my kids, I can yell, "Shut up," and they don't, they don't pay any attention to me, but he could get other politicians to stop talking, just like, shh. It's like having a magical power, which is the root of the word charisma, has that sense about it. So for his supporters, he's more than just a politician or a presidential candidate. He's a champion, he's a legend, and he's a leader of a movement, which he legitimately is. And this has been an extraordinary phenomenon, because the way movements usually work in American politics, in our society, you have a fringe group, that takes to the streets, say in the 1960s in opposition to the Vietnam War. First, there are not many of them, then they get really big, and then you have people, writing and saying, maybe we should take these crazy ideas that these people have seriously. Then you have politicians that are a little bit out there. We're going to adopt these ideas and maybe advance their legislation in Congress that expresses their ideas, and then eventually you take over a party, right? That's how a movement succeeds. Reagan, by the way, his line about anti-war protesters at the time was that they say make love, not war, but it doesn't look like they can do either of those things, to be honest. But Trump is just this bolt out of a blue. Totally new figure, totally disrupts the Republican Party. And now, as we speak, there's a process in train to create a movement around him and behind him. But this is not how it worked. The movement wasn't first; he was first, and the movement is being created afterwards. Now, the downsides of Trump, obviously, there are many of those as well. One, he distorts the truth and can be deceptive, I think, without even trying. I have a friend who knew someone who did advance work for Trump in Virginia. And in 2016, he had a rally, I think it was in Roanoke, Virginia. And Trump was back in the green room, couldn't see the crowd. We know he cares a lot about crowd size. And they asked this kid, this advance guy, when he came back, hey, how many people are out there? The kid says, sir, I've never seen so many people at an event in Southwest Virginia. It's packed to the rafters. There are 5,000 people out there. Trump says, 8,000 people? And then the kid sees him take out his phone, calls, Joe, you won't believe it. I got 10,000 people down here, right? So he's just a natural exaggerator. It plays into his optimism and his real estate pitch work. He does, though, he will occasionally show extraordinary flashes of self-awareness. So he had me out to Bedminster. I don't know him well, but he had me out to Bedminster last summer to work me a little bit. The typical thing, Rich, you're okay. If you want to be okay, that's fine. You can stay being okay. But there's one thing you can do to become really great, so endorse me. But anyway, this was around the time of the Bud Light controversy. I was talking about how Bud Light was in a bad way because the problem is you go to a freezer and there's a Bud Light there. And now there are all these other varieties of beer that are just as good or better, right? So you don't need the Bud Light. And he was asking me, so wait a minute, you can taste the difference between beers? And I was like, that's a very strange question to ask. But then it occurred to me he doesn't drink. And he actually addressed this once publicly. And what he says, if you think it's crazy how I act now, just think what I'd be like if I drank, right? So Winston Churchill had the completely opposite attitude. After he had been prime minister twice in Britain, and he'd still show up at Parliament, and the young parliamentarians would go hang out with him to kind of get pearls of wisdom from this great world historical statesman. And one of them asked Churchill about drinking once, and what Churchill apparently said is, young man, the key to drinking is to drink a little bit too much all the time. So for most of us, that's probably not a good rule. Might be some rules for some fraternity brothers here at Ole Miss, but that's another topic entirely. But also the downside of Trump is he's unnecessarily alienating to people. It's one thing to take a principled stand on an issue that you know is going to be unpopular. It's another thing just to piss people off for no reason, which he very often does. So he's never been popular. He's actually more popular now than he's ever been, but he's still a little bit underwater. His favorability rating is below his unfavorable rating. And now he's in this race against Kamala Harris. Now with Harris, we've seen this extraordinary transformation. She went from what was pretty much regarded universally as a subpar vice president to the second coming of Barack Obama in about 48 hours, right? And part of this was the media puffing her up. Part of this was the Democrats were just so relieved to be rid of the anchor of Joe Biden. And she had this great advantage of being able to skip competitive primaries and caucuses, because what happens in that environment, it's Democrat on Democrat contention. So the media will cover it fairly. If Kamala Harris makes a gaffe, they'll cover it. If she changes position, flip-flop on something, they'll ask her why, and they'll litigate it extensively, because it's not Donald Trump, someone they hate, criticizing her. It might be Pete Buttigieg criticizing her, or Gavin Newsom. So she was able to skip that whole environment and parachute into a race where the media is obviously on her side against Donald Trump, and she has been executing this rather extraordinary move to the center, where usually you flip-flop on one thing in a presidential race, it is litigated for weeks. You got to have an explanation. The media writes what's called TikTok stories. This is when candidate X began to reconsider this issue, and this is the debate his or her team had internally, and then this is how they decided to roll it out. There's been none of that, and she's changed like 25 things. I mean, it's really been extraordinary, the changes she's executed from what she said in 2019 and 2020. I don't think it's highly credible, but they're trying to make it work, and to their credit, she has been highly on message, with a few exceptions here or there. I think if you took her back in time and said, you got to go deliver the Gettysburg Address, she would say, I'm so glad to be with you tonight, this afternoon on this hallowed ground. I grew up in a middle-class family where people really cared about the lawns, right? But there's a reason you repeat things over and over again until they become parodic. So I think just three factors, and then I'll finish up on the election to look at. One, who wins the debate over change? People are unhappy with the status quo. You got an incumbent president, like 40% approval. She's the sitting vice president. Can she say, I'm new and different, and I represent change? Or does Trump win that argument? Trump was winning that argument going away against Joe Biden, right? And it almost didn't matter what the substance was, because you can't be changed when you're the incumbent president and you're doddering around like you could fall over and pass away at any hour. You can't be the change agent. She has much better chance of making that case, and in some polls leads on the question of who's going to bring change, extraordinarily enough. Now, the problem she hasn't achieved really any separation from Joe Biden. She doesn't have any one policy where she says she would do anything different. This was the gaffe she made in the View TV show last week, where she was asked by a friendly interview, what would you different? She said, I can't think of anything. So Republicans instantly got that in ads. So who wins that debate is going to be a key determiner of who wins. Obviously, we have this huge education divide in our politics. This is not something Trump created. It had been a dynamic prior to the rise of Trump. It's a dynamic we've seen across the Western world in advanced democracies, where non-college educated people are more attracted to the Republicans or parties of the right, and college-educated people are going to the Democrats or the parties of the left. But this is a double-edged sword, right? Because the problem Harris has, she's doing extremely well among college-educated people, which is boosting her campaign, but she's performing about as well with working-class voters as Biden was right before he got out. So that low, and she's underperforming where he was in 2020 among working-class voters by about 10 points. And the problem is every single swing state, working-class voters are overrepresented, especially in the key blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And this accounts, this phenomenon is upstream from what we've also seen, that Trump, amazingly enough, is forging a coalition that's more multiracial. He has more appeal now to Latinos and Latino men, and especially African-American men, and that's a subset of this phenomenon. If you have true working-class appeal, and we're dividing along those lines, they're not just working-class white people, although they're talked about most in our political discussion. There are a lot of working-class Latino and African-American folks, and some of them are find Trump more appealing than would have seemed possible 8 years ago or so. And then finally, there's the gender gap. Again, not something new in American politics, but it's bigger than it's ever been before. Just a lot of women find Trump just absolutely repellent, and a lot of guys look at Kamala Harris and consider her basically Hillary Clinton without the charm. Okay, so a lot depends. How big is her advantage among women? How big is his advantage among men? Which one is bigger? Who shows up? So you got to think that Harris has an advantage here because women are more reliable voters. I was talking to a friend a couple weeks ago about something Trump doing, not appealing to fence sitters. And he's like, Rich, you don't understand. He doesn't need fence sitters. He needs couch sitters, right? He needs the guy who's sitting on his couch right now, has a bong on his coffee table, probably has an OnlyFans account, and is playing video games all day long and doesn't believe anything he hears in the news or from conventional media sources. He needs to get that guy to vote for him. And that's difficult. That guy on election day, he could either go to White Castle or he can go vote for Donald Trump. And the future of the republic may depend on that choice. My guess, for whatever it's worth, I would narrowly favor Trump to win. I think people are disaffected with the status quo. I think he will win the change argument. And he's leading on the economy, inflation, although she's tightened that up, and on the border. And they're the three biggest issues. They're not the only issues. She obviously has a huge advantage on abortion, but I think that'll be enough to put him over the top. But we're looking again at a very narrow election, right? Tens of thousands of voters basically decided it, and a couple states in 16, they decided a different way, and a couple states in 20, and that's probably what we're looking at this time as well. And I'd be very skeptical that we'll know the outcome on election night because it'll be close, and key states like Pennsylvania take forever to count. So that's my take on contemporary politics. Now let me go to a deeper debate and deeper divide that I think is implicated in the campaign, although it's not directly discussed. And this has to do with the nature of our society, the nature of America, the legitimacy of America really at its root. And I think we've seen a move the last several years to turn our history against ourselves. And the most prominent example of this, although it's not the only one, is the New York Times 1619 project, where It argues that the founding was about protecting slavery, which is a certifiable lie. It says that suggests or heavily implies that the property and slaves was directly protected in the Constitution, when that formulation and the word slavery were explicitly not put in the Constitution by the founders, because they were hoping the institution, even though they couldn't destroy it then, would eventually go away. They're too optimistic about that, but that was their assumption. And it suggests that after the Revolution, there's a hardening of the racial caste system in America, when the complete opposite was true. Certainly in the northern states, after 1776 and the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, incompletely realized you had a loosening of racial discrimination and slavery, and a bunch of states abolished slavery or said they were going to abolish it by a time certain. But this has been hugely influential, this project, and as far as I can tell, is the first time ever a society has lied about itself, right? The natural human tendency, kind of tribal tendency, you lie about the other guys, right? The French lie about the Germans, and the Germans lie about the French. Maybe the French don't have to lie that much about the Germans to be really disparaging about the Germans. But you lie about the other people. You don't lie about your own society. And I just fear this could have dire consequences. And because what you tell yourself about yourself determines what you are at the end of the day. And there's a great historian named William McNeill, and he wrote about this point. And he said, people without a full quiver of relevant, agreed-upon statements accepted in advance through education or less formalized acculturation soon finds itself in deep trouble, for, in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or sustain. And the example he used, the British were sustained during the Blitz in World War II by this idea that they were the plucky island nation that always lost initially and was back on its heels, but always persevered to defeat continental tyranny. That's what they believed about themselves. And there was good reason to believe about it, but believing made it, it helped make it a reality, I should say. So what we're talking about here is myths in the highest sense. We're not talking about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. We're talking about themes and heroes of your national history. So let me illustrate this point with actually by reference to a painting we all know, right? Washington crossing the Delaware, Emanuel Lutz. We all know this, right? It's one of the foremost visual cliches in American history. Now, this painting has been subject to all sorts of debunking for some understandable reasons. You know, they have that beautiful American flag, Stars and Stripes. It didn't exist, right? It didn't exist yet. It would have been a regimental flag, but there's no stars and stripes, so no one was holding it up while they're crossing the Delaware. The guy holding it is James Monroe, the first future president, really important officer in Washington's army. He wasn't in a boat. He didn't cross the Delaware. He stayed on shore that evening. They crossed at night, okay? So you wouldn't have this luminous light on everything. And it was a nor'easter, right? So it also wasn't so beautiful and shiny. And finally, ice, ice on a river. It's not like these not beautiful, they're technically, the painting is fantastic, but they're not like these beautiful cubes you put in your bourbon, right? It's flat, okay? So all that's wrong. It's totally wrong. But then you flip it around and you look at what's right about that painting. You only see a few boats, right? And this was truly a small scale action. These are like 2,400 guys, right? You look at their faces and there's this sense of desperation and fear even. And that's true too, right? This is a roll of the dice, everything on the part of George Washington, who naturally was aggressive in his personality, but realized the army had to survive. That was the main thing. So he usually adopted a Fabian strategy. I'm going to fade away and not have a decisive action. But those 24 hours, the whole army was on the line. Plus, a lot of these guys, almost all of them, couldn't swim. Colonial Americans couldn't swim. So you might be scared if you're in the middle of the river during a storm. You get all sorts of dress, right? There's no one military uniform, and that's the way it was. The foremost kind of nationalizing institution at that time was the Continental Army. It brought all these people together from places and regions who never would have encountered one another otherwise. And in terms of the diversity, there's some people that think one person in the boat is a woman, and I think probably the ladies in the room might agree with that interpretation. because she's the only one rowing. She's doing all the work, right? And the guys are just standing there. And then they're standing. Like, who stands in a boat in that circumstance, right? But these were flat-bottom boats, and we don't know, but there's a strong chance that George Washington and others were standing in these boats. So I defy you not to go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where this painting is, all 12 feet tall, and not be awed. Not be awed. So yeah, that painting is a myth. It's wrong about very important things, and it's a myth. It hits on a profound truth about our country and about those men who saved the cause at the beginning. And that's what a country needs. That's what sustains a country, and that's what we're losing. And I think it's also important to remember just the deep cultural currents that underlie the foundations of this country. I just want to delve into this a little bit. So let's take James Madison, right, the father of the Constitution. Where is James Madison in pretty much any other culture? Where is a comparable figure in, say, the Spanish Empire or the Russian Empire? This person does not exist, right? That doesn't mean there aren't talented people in those places and places all around the world. You might say like sort of a Russian analog to Madison, just in terms of sheer talent, might be Potemkin, right? The whole idea of a Potemkin village is a myth. He really built villages, extremely skilled administrator, maybe a more skilled administrator than James Madison, who did let the White House get burned down, but a really interesting, sophisticated guy. He traveled with an orchestra. He traveled with an English garden. He loved English culture, so they bury it whenever, plant it whenever he stopped someplace, and then they'd dig it up and take it to the next place. There are advantages to being friends of the Tsar or Tsarina in his case. In Russia at the time, but he wasn't creating a republic. He didn't care about Republican ideas. He was extending the Russian Empire and serving a tyrant. That's what he did, right? So there's no other James Madison, except for maybe comparable figures in England, but there's no other James Madison because he was a product of our cultural soil. I am a believer in the deep foundational lingering effects of national identity, as Bob Newhart used to say. Being 3/4 German and 1/4 Irish made him a very meticulous drunk, right? But more seriously, these things affect who you are, what your ideas are. And if you allow me just to use another example. So if I asked you what are the 3 foundational ideas in the American Revolution, probably one that you'd say would be no taxation without representation. So where does that come from, right? Where did that idea come from? Well, to answer that question, you need to realize that England is a barbarian society, right? Now, I say this as an Anglophile. I love the British. I'm glad we've had no acts of hostility since the War of 1812, with the possible exception that we did give them Meghan Markle. In their wisdom, they sent her right back. But what I mean by that is when the Romans decided they could no longer hold Britain, the Emperor Honorius says, guys, you're on your own, famous letter. They get invaded by the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. They get invaded by the Vikings. They get invaded by the Normans, who are just Vikings who had been in Normandy for a while and became Normans, but they were Vikings. And the Great Constitutional Settlement in England in 1688 is the product of an invasion from Northern Europe, from the Netherlands. And the important thing about this, for this purpose, is these Germanic people had this tradition that the king rules with his council, right? The Great Council, they might call it. And what happens is comes over to England, and slowly over time, this council becomes a kind of proto-parliament. Some historians think by the 920s, there's an identifiable parliament that exists, not in current form, but a parliament that exists in some proto-form in England. And the first recorded instance, as far as anyone can tell, of a parliament, of a council, saying no to a king who was asking for more taxes was 1197. All right, do you know what other enduring achievements for self-government happened in 1197 in the rest of the world? Anyone? Nothing, right? Zero. But this just goes to how we come up with this idea, no taxation without representation, that had existed for about 500 years previously. Imperfectly, it needed to be built out, it needed to be built upon, but what happens is these ideas, they don't come out of nowhere. They're not like Athena out of the head of Zeus. They're built by this accretion of intellectual effort and culture over time. And what basically happened, to simplify terribly, the British write down these ideas, and then we write them down more extensively and better. So if you go to the National Archives, which right after you go to the Met, you come down on the Acela Express, go to the National Archives if you haven't, in Washington, D.C., and they have right there in the lobby this display of Magna Carta, the Declaration, and the Constitution. And again, it is so moving and magnificent. Behind these glass cases, like ice cream at an urban drugstore, protected by this glass. But you can just see the progression literally there. And it's real writing, too. We say we write things, but we don't. We tap things digitally. They go over to someone else digitally. These things were really written down. If you could get to them, you could run your finger and feel the ridges of ink on this parchment. And there was a horrible act of vandalism there, by the way, where I think it was climate protesters went in and threw this fine red dust on these cases that was such an unusual and invasive substance for a while. They didn't know how to clean it. And initially, the authorities said, this is going to be misdemeanor. And to her credit, the head of the National Archives says, no, this is a serious offense. These people have to be charged with felonies. So this is our inheritance. And the Constitution now itself, I'm talking about the long lineage of things. The Constitution itself now has this long lineage. And there's a scholar named Walter Burns, who was once invited, he was at AEI, an expert on the Constitution, was invited to a constitutional conference in Brazil. And he was given the opportunity to give the keynote address on constitutions. And someone from Brazil got up and said, wait a minute, why is the American giving the keynote address? They've only had one constitution and we've had 10, right? So that's the point, isn't it? Right? That's the point. And I'll just conclude with this. I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, however much you enjoy our politics, how much you hate it, right, left, and center, or wherever you are, you should really be grounded in a profound sense of gratitude for all we have undeservedly. In terms of Western civilization, I mean, who has done anything to deserve the achievements of Beethoven or Rembrandt or Dickens or Twain? In terms of our own system, who there was struggling for parliamentary supremacy centuries ago, or wrote the Declaration of Independence, or helped think through and draft and argue about the Constitution? None of us were in Philadelphia in 1787. None of us were at Normandy in 1944. None of us were at Selma in 1963. But we've been bequeathed all this, and it enriches our lives in ways we don't even acknowledge every single day. And so I think a key task, or one of them, is just to realize how precious all that is and how we've been given it and how we need to protect it. We don't need to tear it down. We just need to hold ourselves together. And I'll just conclude with this famous passage from a Lincoln speech called the Lyceum Address. Before he was president, before anyone knew about him, as a young lawyer. And he talked about how even then, when he was talking in the earlier mid-19th century, that this country was invulnerable to military assault. He said you could take the greatest genius, military genius of all time, Napoleon, give him the biggest army of all time, and that army could not take a step on the Blue Ridge Mountains or drink from the Mississippi River by force of arms. Then he went on to say, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher, and we either must live through all time as a nation of free men or die by suicide. And I submit to all of you this evening that we need to resolve to live. Thank you very much.
So here's the first question. There's always this question about reality and appearance. Mm-hmm. And you said you thought that Trump was going to sort of win the argument about change. And I guess, could you maybe help maybe a skeptic understand, how do we know that we're just getting the appearance of change from Trump, or whether he really could deliver actual real change? Because I can imagine people thinking, look, the guy was president for 4 years. He had his chance to make some changes, and he wasn't able to do it. So why would this time be any different? So what do you think there could be real change this time?
Well, first of all, I think the thing with Trump is I don't think he was ever, I don't know whether he was ever above 50% approval when he was president, but he has been since leaving office when people look back in retrospect, especially those first 3 years. And I don't think he would have lost in 2020 if it weren't for the pandemic. And people now appropriately are kind of putting in parentheses around that as some once in a century event that no one had control over, right? But the first 3 years were pretty good. And I think he delivered important changes. Like there was a lot of chaos, and it was shambolic, but a historic tax reform, really important deregulation, a continued appointment of constitutionalist judges to the court, who in the Supreme Court, overturned this travesty of Roe v. Wade. Now that's obviously there's some political liability there. The Abraham Accords, which totally reversed how people had thought about the Middle East. So the typical thing is you got to, and this is what Biden's trying to do, you straddle between the two sides, and then you work out a negotiation, everything's going to be fine. What Trump's insight and the people around him was, no, you totally back Israel, and then the Arabs realized, well, they're not going to get anything from the U.S. government. They have to deal with Israel. And that was working and beginning to work, which was one of the reasons we saw October 7th to disrupt that process. So I think it was, all in all, it was pretty effective. But the tension is, do you focus on that? The results were better. Maybe I didn't like everything he said or tweeted, but the results are better. Or do you focus on, it was chaotic, it was exhausting, he was personally offensive to me. That's, if it's the first, Trump's going to win. If it's the second, Trump's going to lose. And I would think the natural play for Trump is just to emphasize this part. Don't do this, right? But he just sort of can't help himself. And I think he's done a lot to remind people what they didn't like. So the thing's on a knife's edge. But I think it'll be pretty effective again. But will be effective in ways that I might not like. I think he's quite serious about tariffs, and we're going to see some tariffs where I think he's right about China, but I don't think he's right about 10 or 20% tariffs across the board. Maybe they'll just be wielded as leverage and negotiation tactic. That's what kind of the optimists who aren't into tariffs around Trump hope and believe. But she is promising, basically. She jettisoned the left-wing stuff from 19 to 20 and is promising basically to continue everything Biden was doing. So it just seems to me he should win that argument. I'm not guaranteeing he will, but I'm guessing he will.
All right, yeah. I also wanted to be sure to ask you sort of about, the conservative intellectual movement as it's existed even before Trump and as it exists now. I think a lot of us in this room probably agree with you that having a narrative, a common narrative, one that embodies our ideals, one that we can agree on, is important for us to have a sense of what's important, or why American freedom is valuable, and all of that. And so here's my question for you. So what has the conservative intellectual movement been doing for the last 40 years? Where did conservative intellectuals kind of get off stop doing their job so that we kind of lost the narrative? What could we have done differently so that we didn't find ourselves in a position where we're pleading with people to recover the narrative, pleading for people to go and recover the myths of our founding? What is it that we've been doing so that we find ourselves in a position where someone like Trump had to come along?
Well, I think maybe there are two questions there, or at least let me separate it. And if that's not what you meant, just let me know. One, we've been losing. We've been losing institutions, and most importantly, losing academia, right? We've been losing the fight for the education system. So these lies are told to our children. We pay money to people to lie to our kids and turn them against our own society. And we've seen this with the pro-Hamas protests. They're a relative fringe in the scheme of things. I don't think most kids think that way, but a lot do. And they didn't come up with it on their own. They've been taught that by their professors. So I think there just needs to be much more focus. I think Ron DeSantis has been good on this. In a red state, there should be no woke public universities. There just shouldn't be. It should be straight, conventional, down the line, mainstream, American history and education. You want to get more adventurous with some elective you take, fine. But let's bring back Western Civ education. Let's make sure we're telling our kids the truth about our society. And then if they want to, do other boutique things around the edges, fine. They can do that. And for me, this is not a free speech issue, because public education is public. It's a government thing. And at the end of the day, government is determining in one form or other what the curriculum is. And we have not been paying as much attention to this, and we've been losing that fight, and we can't afford as a society to do it anymore. With Trump, I think, there are times, and I was very opposed to him in the primaries in 2016, National Review was, there are times I'd look at my shelf of books, Hayek and Kirk, it's like, what does any of this matter, right? There's this guy just coming in, he hasn't read about any of this stuff, he doesn't care about any stuff, and he's stomping us. And so I've come to believe that just there's no substitute for a charismatic political leader. There isn't. Conservatives, and especially National Review, will occasionally tell ourselves Bill Buckley created Ronald Reagan. He didn't. Ronald Reagan was a movie star, before Bill Buckley. Ronald Reagan was going to be an amazing political figure, whether it was a Bill Buckley or not. Now, Bill was good friends with him and helped inform him and helped create an intellectual environment that Reagan soaked in, and that was good. But you need your Reagan. And the fact is the populists in the party got their equivalent of Reagan and Donald Trump.
Well, this will be the last question, then we'll turn over to the audience. I'm glad you mentioned William Buckley. As anyone who knows anything about the conservative intellectual movement knows, is that conservatives have always been disagreeing with one another. They've always been, had different factions. And one of the remarkable things that William Buckley was able to do was to bring together these different conservative intellectuals so that they could move in the same direction in some way, and there could be a movement. So do you see anyone now who is Buckley-esque? Is there anyone out there who you think could kind of bring together the different conservative intellectuals that are all debating and in different parts, and could form some kind of intellectual consensus for conservatism now? Or do you think there's so much fracture and so much debate that we're still kind of muddling our way through to find some kind of settlement?
I think it's more of the latter. I think Buckley, obviously, the persona, the charisma, again, I'll come back to charisma, was so important, but it was also, in part what he was able to do was a product of a different media environment where you had three conservative publications. You had National Review, the American Spectator came along, and Human Events, right? It was sort of the equivalent of like three broadcast networks that now are also much less important because the media environment's been blown up and disaggregated. So it came with a certain guardrails with that. National Review will publish you. If we don't publish you, you're kind of outside the mainstream. Doesn't mean you might have some other means of getting the word out. But that's all that's blown up, and it's a factor of, I think, what's been a good trend, the small d democratization of the media, where everyone can be an influencer, everyone can be have a voice without being accredited by anyone. But the downside it is, our society more broadly and within the conservatism, it does make it harder to get people unified around various ideas. And I think it's been, the main thing I find depressing is how acrimonious the interconservative debate can be now. We treat ourselves as the enemies if we have disagreements on tariffs or whatever it is, when there's an obvious common enemy, and we should be debating as friends what the way ahead is and what the best ideas and policies are.
All right. We'll go ahead and turn it over to some questions from the audience here. If you've got a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and we can bring a mic to you. So we could start over here with, Lee.
Hi, Rich. Thanks for coming. Lee Habib. I went to UVA Law with Laura Ingraham, and we started a little radio show. Yeah. And if I could just make one point before a quick question, it'll be very quick. Yeah. But I don't think it was Trump's charisma alone, because he was listening to the Laura Ingraham show, and he was listening to the Glenn Beck show. And there was a populist movement happening right through the Tea Party movement. And if he had run in 2008 or 2012, he would have had no chance. I think it was a confluence of factors, political factors, particularly with the working class, that finally some elements of the conservative movement were directly attacking. And our show grew meteorically, and all the shows that grew were doing Trump before Trump. And I think he was the surfer. He wasn't the wave. But he was to your point, he was a great charismatic personality. But I don't think it would have happened in a vacuum. But to the question, Chevron case, which Laura and I, when we were in law school, this was the reason we wanted to start a national show, to talk about the importance of the courts, but particularly this idea that the Congress could punt to the administrative agencies all of these decisions. What happened in '84, we went to law school in '88. Talk about the importance of that case for folks who don't know it. And talk also about the wins in the states, Rich, because these ESAs are creating a revolution in the education savings accounts. And it's up to $1 billion in Arizona that the taxpayers are getting to send their kids to Catholic schools. I don't think we talk enough about our wins on the state level and on these lesser known cases like the Chevron case, which everyone should know about.
Yeah, so those great questions. It's a great point. I take your clarification on there were forerunners like Laura, and there have been a lot of media figures who are kind of opportunistic and they globbed onto Trump when they realized he's going to be the next big thing. She was advocating for this kind of populism before Trump, and there were some others as well. So Chevron's very important. You have administrative agencies basically been able to make policy and in effect law on their own. This is just not how the system should work, and has been a function of the fact that Congress has abdicated its constitutional responsibility. So the Madisonian system is based on the jealousy of the various wings of the American government. The judiciary doesn't want anyone interfering with it. It wants to be the judiciary, right? The executive wants to execute the laws and do executive things. Congress is supposed to want to legislate, right? But it's gotten in this mode where you'll have members of Congress going lobbying the president do things on his own, right? Which Madison would be shocked. Where's your self-respect? Where's your institutional self-respect? Chuck Schumer should be outraged, right? He's a legislature through and through. He spent decades climbing the greasy pole and gotten to the top, the leader of the Democratic Party. He should be infuriated that Joe Biden wants to legislate a student loan program on his own. Instead, because he's ideologically in favor of it and he wants to happen, he's like, great, it's legal, you can do it, And that's just not how the system is supposed to work. And it's not just the court, and I think even people on the right of center can fall into this mistake. It's not just the court that's supposed to enforce the Constitution. Everyone else is taking an oath to it too, and has a responsibility to enforce it as they see fit and hew to it and abide by it. ESAs, hugely important. This is hitting on two things we've lost on a lot, where we've been winning. One, the fight over how to interpret the Constitution, where we've been winning stunning victories. Maybe you and Laura anticipated them, or maybe you've been shocked by them, but I think they're shocking in a good way. And also the progress we made on school choice. So one way to deal with education is to kind of grab the controls of public education, try to get the curriculum in a better place. Another way is to just create end runs around it by empowering people to go to schools that represent their values and their standards. And we've made a lot of progress on that too.
So you kind of touched on this topic. You kind of went around it, where now in today's world where we have revisionist history, you mentioned the 1619 Project from the left, but we're kind of seeing that in a sense on the right? Recently, Tucker Carlson just had a revisionist who kind of said that Winston Churchill was the architect of the Holocaust and all that, and he was the main villain. And so people have quoted and said, this is kind of now forming what is potentially going to be the woke right? People who are on the left believed in the institutions. Now we have people who don't believe in the institutions and will believe in whoever is not. So how do we address this problem so that we don't become the very thing we're fighting right now?
It's a great question, and I think you're on to something. So I used to know Tucker. I haven't talked to him in a while, so I'm speculating. But I think what happened with Tucker, what's happening is he realized with the rise of Trump and people being wrong about Trump, including me, I was wrong about a lot of things, but he drew the conclusion that conventional wisdom, what everyone else is saying is correct, what all the experts say is wrong. Now, there's a lot to be said for kicking the tires and doubting it and being skeptical, but I think it's gone deeper than that, where he thinks these people are wrong and fundamentally corrupt, and they run America, therefore America is fundamentally corrupt. He'd never say that. I'm speculating. I can't prove it. So then you get, as you say, this kind of whiplash thing where you have from the right, the left has denounced Winston Churchill forever. He's a colonialist. He was a colonialist, but he had a lot of other great qualities. He said offensive things. He did say offensive things, it was 100 years ago. But that doesn't detract from his greatness. But then you have the right, from the right, this attack that Winston Churchill is a warmonger, right? That Winston Churchill started the war when he wasn't even in power yet. He came to power because the war started and they needed a great captain of war, which they got in Churchill. So I think it is indisputable that this is the greatest country in world history, warts and all, sins and all, and I think that's the kind of starting point. And we should be truthful about our history and about our sins, but we need to realize what made it so great and how to preserve it. So I'm very worried about that trend.
Thank you for your talk. I had a twofold question about the beyond part. One of the things that's particularly interesting in our current political moment is losing does not seem to detract from people's political stranglehold. Obviously, Trump is one example. Despite losing the presidency in the midterms, he still is a magnetic, influential figure. And we could say the same about Bernie Sanders even, despite losing repeatedly. Sanders and his wing still has an interesting stranglehold. So I'm curious if you could, do some punditry for us. What does a Trump defeat possibly look like for the future of the Republican Party, and what does a Harris defeat possibly look like for the Democratic Party? Big question, but curious.
These are great questions. That's a great question too. So I don't know about Trump. If he loses, he's going to deny he lost. I think he's so. In 16, he really denied that he won. He said he won by much more, than they counted. So a lot of people will believe him. Look, what's happened is unprecedented and not great. It's not great to have a nominee no one voted for, right? It's not great to have a media that's so dishonest, but you got to punch through those things. And if he loses, it would have been a winnable race that I think he lost by his own behavior. But it'll be total civil war. I think Trump will blame everyone, might try to blame J.D. Vance. I think it's harder because J.D. was so great in that debate. He'll definitely blame pro-lifers and the abortion issue. And he's not going to say, he'll say he's running again in 28. And that'll scare a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people would have thought you lost in 20, you're going to go away. And he's like, no, I'm not. And he was right. And they're going to be like, you're going to be right again. Why am I going to run? But I do think there'll be more room for, the coalition, GOP coalition is classical liberals and populists. Usually the classical liberals have been dominant. Now the populists are dominant. There might be more room for shifting around in that, but it'll be highly unpredictable and unstable. With Democrats, it should lead to a lot of soul searching on their part. I think they'll just conclude she wasn't any good, right? And it doesn't matter that they're insisting she's great now, right? With Biden, they insisted until the moment he walked on that stage and proved how unsuitable it was, that he was fine, he was great, right? They just lied to us. And then the next day they switched around and no one said, oh, we're sorry for lying to you, right? And they'll do the same thing. All of a sudden it'll be like, Kamala was just a disaster, she was vacuous, she's never gonna make it. Where they really should conclude that they need to moderate, especially on cultural stuff. And the most effective issue that's out there right now, both in the presidential race and the Senate race, is pushing back against trans insanity, right? Where all these Democrats thought they could go along with the fashionable progressive trend the way they always do, and that people could be bullied into going along or staying silent, as unfortunately usually happens, and they get away with being on the wrong side of a 70-30 issue, whether males should compete with females, whether we should be having these life-changing surgeries and hormonal treatment on minors, right? And Republicans found their voice on that one and have been killing them on it, justifiably. But they should be examining that, but I think they'll tend to just think she was a flawed vessel, is my guess.
So you talked a little bit about sort of the idea of building a movement after a candidate rather than a movement being built that led to a candidate. Do you think that project will be successful, or do you think in 100 years historians will kind of be looking back and saying, this was sort of an anomaly, a candidate who managed to capture something that then kind of wasn't replicated moving forward?
Yeah, that's another great question. I don't have an answer. I don't know what's going to happen in 3 weeks. I don't know what's going to happen in 100 years. But I think it'll be more enduring than Trump. the Republican Party is never going back to the way it was in 2004. I'm confident in saying that, no matter what happens. And I think there's a chance the party, it's not guaranteed, but the party could become more populist after Trump. J.D. Vance is more populist than Trump is. The way I look at it, to do a Fox primetime analogy, Bill O'Reilly was a populist on Fox at the 8 p.m. hour. He didn't care about the conservative movement. He was allied with conservatives most of the time, but didn't really believe what they believed, just didn't care. Tucker really cared about the conservative movement and wanted to change it and make it more populist and knew where the bodies were buried and was kind of plugged in at this level to try to do it and has had a lot of success. So I think Trump's a little bit more a Bill O'Reilly figure. He doesn't want to destroy conservatism or change it. He just wants everyone to support him. And what he always says to me is like, Rich, you're a conservative, that's fine. I'm common sense, but there's an overlap. Whereas JD, I think, wants it to be a populist movement and wants people like me to be marginalized or not have a big go along, but really be in the caboose of what's fundamentally a populist party. Does he succeed in that? I don't know. It's as a Japanese saying is, an inch ahead is darkness. So I don't know what's going to happen in 3 weeks. I don't know how strong JD is hugely impressive as an advocate, hugely impressive. But does he have this magical pixie dust charisma? I haven't seen it yet. I don't think he's very winsome. I think he's impressive. So if Trump does sort of get out of the way, there are going to be 20 candidates running in 2028. But JD will be trying to own that populist lane and wrench the party further in that direction. So maybe a last thought on this. And with the conservative history terms, we talk about fusionism, right? The National Review and Bill Buckley created this concept where you get the national security conservatives and the limited government conservatives and the traditional values conservatives all together, largely because they have a common enemy in the Soviet Union. And maybe we look back at Trump as kind of the fusionist in this context, because he adopted a lot of traditional Republican economic agenda, and JD would want to jettison that. So we'll see. It's going to be a fascinating couple of years.
Other question? Actually, I have a question. So far we're only talking about America. But it does seem like the same sorts of things, the rise of the populace, has been going on not just in America, but Brazil, Italy, France, England, Europe. I mean, this isn't just a strange one-off in America because this amazingly charismatic person just seems like there's something structural going on in liberal democracies here over the last, how many decades you want to talk about. Do you have any theory about what that is?
Yeah.
What's going on so that similar types of phenomena are appearing in so many different places?
So it's a reaction to the left going woke. They're not just social democrats who want more welfare programs anymore. There's this deeper critique of our own society, and a common theme is a reaction to out-of-control migration. And this is one of the extraordinary things in this race. Mass deportation, when Trump said it in 2016, was like a whoa. It hurt your ears. You couldn't believe he said it. He was asked by interviewers, "How's that going to happen? How are you going to do it? Is that possible?" It's more than 50% support for mass deportation now, which is entirely a reaction to the absolute insanity at the border, where they blew up a system that was working. Deliberately, they knew exactly what they were doing. And for 3 years, said it was fine. There's no crisis, nothing to see here. And then when they looked at the polls and finally, this was not a mystery, finally figured out that they're going to be running against the guy who'd made the border his signature issue. So maybe you try to play defense or do something about this. Now they've done a little bit, mostly by covering it up and kind of redirecting the illegal flows into new innovative theoretically legal flows that they've made. But we've seen that kind of reaction around the Western world, and then also just the education, the divide among education. You're getting more working class people. The way politics works, you got to have a more working class agenda. You become more populist.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Over.
Do you think there'll be a October surprise 1, 2, 3?
Will be the 3 October surprises, or
Do you think there will be an October surprise?
oh, sorry. Yeah, probably. I can't tell you what it is. I wouldn't be a surprise then. I will tell you, though, I was having this conversation with a group a couple weeks ago, and someone raised this question. It seems like there should be one, right? I mean, it's been so crazy the last 3 months. It'd almost be disappointing there's not an October surprise. But someone said, it's almost like the script writers are writing this program that's the election and coming up with these crazy twists. And I was like, yeah, whatever they're doing, throwing the ideas around. I know one of them is probably saying right now, we can't do another assassination attempt. And that was on Friday. And Saturday, there was another assassination attempt. And it's also extraordinary that we have to enumerate the assassination attempts against Trump now. There's 1, 2, and I guess maybe there's a third that might have happened. And that they've disappeared so quickly. And that the first one, they blamed him for nearly getting shot in the head, is perverse. So, it's 3 weeks. A lot could happen.
So I want to follow up on Stephen's comment about what happened overseas, international movements. So my understanding is that there are actually networks that are actively being built. Viktor Orban in Hungary being very proactive in building international networks of conservatives. Nigel Farage actually coming to the US at a certain point to support Donald Trump and now building his own reform party. Erdogan in Turkey also being active to try to establish relationship with Central European leaders. In your experience, what have you seen of this network building here in the US? And does it matter for American conservatives and especially for the more nationalist and populist brand of American conservatism?
You're right. There has been a really concerted effort along these lines, and I think it's been pretty effective. I think Orban and intellectuals around him have made an effort to kind of market his model. And I think there's things to recommend it. The immigration restriction, the kind of societal self-confidence. But in general, I just don't think a small Central European country has a lot to teach us, about being a continental nation of our nature. But there's no doubt that these figures have played in the U.S. and it's had an effect.
Yeah. I'm trying to ask you, what are you seeing specifically in terms of network building? Are there relationships being built? I'm thinking about Tucker Carlson interviewing both Putin and Dugin. So is there anything coming out of that, or it is just superficial at this point?
No, I think it matters. You can go to CPAC and you'll see Hungarian guys there. Getting to know people, telling them about Orban, having them over to Hungary and junkets and trips and learn about them. I mean, there are a number of prominent conservative intellectuals that Rod Dreher, for instance, a great writer, used to be with National Review, is more populist nationalist now. I think lives in Hungary now, and is just convinced it's this great model. So it's definitely had. This isn't going to change the course of the right, all of the right, but it's definitely had an influence among an element that have a voice. So it's something to focus on.
All right, maybe we'll just take one last question here. Yeah, go ahead.
So I respect you and your opinion, of course, on all of your political stances, but I wanted to know, you've hit on J.D. Vance.
There's going to be a but there.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
You've hit on J.D. Vance a little bit, but I kind of want to know your stance on Governor Walz and some of the things you believe he's good at and also some of the things you believe he's kind of poor at.
I mean, I think he's a total doofus. I'm sorry. If she loses, which is quite possible, she's probably going to lose Pennsylvania. And how are you going to explain, like 100 years from now, I am confident 100 years from now, if she loses Pennsylvania, they'll be saying, why didn't she pick Josh Shapiro? You have this incumbent Democratic governor of Pennsylvania who's popular and is an incredibly polished performer, a somewhat annoyingly polished performer, but, that's fine. And she didn't pick him, maybe because his pro-Israel stuff, or I think it is, as we've seen some reporting indicate, she wasn't comfortable with him and maybe a little threatened by how good he was. But do the pick that's going to help you get the electoral votes to win, and then you don't have to see him ever again, right? FDR, thank God he picked Harry Truman. Besides Lincoln, Harry Truman might be the greatest example of someone rising to the occasion in American history, but he didn't talk, he picked him and never saw him, right? I think he had one lunch. Truman knew nothing. He knew nothing about FDR told him nothing. You can do that to Josh Shapiro if you don't like him. So I just think Waltz has brought nothing. I think there's this kind of faux, people who aren't real, like rural people or outdoors. There's an old saying, like, he's an old person's idea of what a young person should be. He's like a non-rural person's idea of what a rural person should be, And if a Republican who'd let people say he'd been in Afghanistan, introducing him or whatnot, and not correct it, it'd be a huge scandal. So I just think he's been a total dud. Do you still respect my opinions or not?
Yeah. Sure, go ahead.
Thank you for being here.
Of course.
We're really proud of this new we're really proud of the new institute, and I've watched you for years, Rich, and we appreciate you coming to Ole Miss. In the 80s and 90s, and maybe even after the turn of the century, there was a real intellectual conservatism group or activities. You had the Heritage and, of course, a Review, Human Events, the Committee for Survival of Free Congress. It was a real activist, intellectual conservatism. Is it there now?
Well, it's just been kind of shattered. So Heritage, for example, has become more populist on key things. So are there conservative intellectuals? Yes. Do some of them believe, as I do, the same things largely that folks in that movement at that point of time believe? Yes, but it's not. We're not as big, and we're not as united as we were.
All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and give Rich Lowry a warm thank you for being here. An interesting conversation.
Thanks so much. Good job.
Thank you.